Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is a great crowd. It's great to have live events back here at AEI. I'm Tim Carney. I am a senior fellow here at AEI, and I'm here with Christine Emba, whom I've known through her Washington Post op-eds. We've been against each other on the left, right, and center show on public radio and various other things, and she's written this excellent book, Rethinking Sex, which as soon as I found out she was writing it, I had to get it and I had to have this discussion here. And in part because I think it was an amazing thing for a conservative Catholic guy like me during the Me Too era to see people saying, you know what, maybe just the baseline idea of consent is not sufficient. And I said, guys, how about this? Maybe there's other things we can do. Maybe we can talk about sex belonging in a context of a committed relationship. Here's some brand new ideas we should throw out there. Christine actually doesn't just come at it from my perspective, sadly, but she does have lots of good ideas in here. Christine and I are going to have a conversation. There will be time for questions later on. There will be a mic going around during the question time, and so I'll call on you and wait for the microphone. There's some people tuning in via live stream. You can submit questions technologically. Email them to Luis Perales, which is Luis period PARRLES @AEI.org, or tweet it with the hashtag that we chose, Beyond Consent. Hashtag Beyond Consent, and we'll try to get to those questions. And after this event, for those of you here in person, we'll have a few copies of the book to give away, and we'll have some beer and wine out right around the auditorium, so stick around. But Christine, why do we need to rethink sex?
Well, a lot of reasons. But first of all, thank you so much for having me at this event. It is delightful to do live events. I planned most of my book tour at the height of Omicron, so we didn't plan that much live. And then by the time the book came out, it was over. That was disappointing. I'm also kind of shocked to see so many people inside an auditorium on a day like today,
like this, yes.
One of the 3 nice days in DC.
It will be summer and gross by Friday. Yes.
Yeah, well, thank you all for coming. As to why we need to rethink sex, well, I mean, I think you just mentioned the Me Too moment, which seems like enough of an excuse going forward. But I'll take you back a little bit to when I started thinking about this topic and then the book, and that was during Me Too. I was writing about, ideas in society, as I do for my column at the Post, and observing this moment, a few things seemed off. First of all, we had these high-profile cases, Harvey Weinstein, Matt Lauer, and it seemed very clear that all of the sort of fixes that we thought we had gotten to post-sexual revolution and feminist movement hadn't actually fixed things as well as we thought. This sort of thing was still happening. But more than those kind of cut and dried cases, yes, please don't rape your assistants in a hotel room, that is bad. I was more interested almost by the not so clear cases, the gray cases. One of, I think, the underlying movements of Me Too that almost took over sort of the movement at the end were stories like Cat Person or the Aziz Ansari debacle, where young women especially seemed to be having these sexual encounters that were not non-consensual, they were ostensibly consensual, and yet they found them sad, depressing, even traumatic. And as those stories came out, the number of people who responded and said, yeah, me too, this is very normal. Actually, this happens all the time. This is just what dating looks like today, was kind of shocking to me. And it bespoke to me that there must be something wrong with our sexual culture if this sort of malaise, if these sort of encounters are the norm, if this is what people expect on their search for partnership, for commitment, or even just a positive date with another human being. So I felt pushed to ask a couple of questions. One was, what assumptions were we making about what sex looks like or means or should look like today that are wrong, that are contributing to this malaise? And what are some things that we have, believed or depended upon that clearly aren't serving us anymore? And consent seemed like one of those very clearly. The fact that we, have all sort of imbibed the no means no, but then actually yes means yes, but actually the yes has to be affirmative, but then it also has to be enthusiastic. All of these modifications on consent seem to have not solved the problem. And then I think we weren't really talking honestly about what we even wanted from sex, what revolution was really supposed to mean, where the feminist movement was supposed to have taken us, and where we ended up. I think we've ended up talking a lot about sort of a legal criterion, how to make sex permissible so that, you don't get arrested, so that you can't be accused of assault. But we haven't spent enough time talking about the moral questions, not just what makes sex allowed, but what makes sex actually good, meaning ethically good, morally good, and contributing to our human flourishing. And I think to answer that question, you have to go all the way back and really rethink sex from the beginning, what it means, what it should look like, what we owe to each other.
And sometimes what I was surprised by in reading your book was what you felt needed to be argued for. And so we'll get to some of that in a bit, but one of the things that surprised me was, as a dude, I sometimes think if we need to talk about sexual ethics, we need to talk about self-restraint, self-control. But you were sort of battling, most of this book was battling against a different idea, an idea that we should be having sex, that young women, because most of this is written from a female perspective, I would say, that young women feel like that there's multiple shoulds, and not just like a dude is pressuring me, but almost culture or being a good, strong woman means I should. Anyway, can you talk about that idea that we should be having more casual sex or more, premarital sex or more sex in our 20s or college or whatever? That was the sort of urge, the push that caught me off guard when I was reading this. Because I'm old. I'm 10 years older than you at least. So.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that was something that, I don't know if I would say it caught me off guard, but because it's sort of in the water I drink and the air I breathe at this point, being a young woman in the world. But the number of times people, both men and women, actually brought this up in interviews, made it feel like it was something that really needed to be addressed. This idea that I really want a relationship, but I don't want to say that because it's weird to say that you want a relationship so early on in a date. I think I would really like, to be committed to someone, but, to be a modern young woman, I'm supposed to be going out on dates, right? I'm supposed to be collecting sexual experiences. I'm supposed to be hooking up and doing this. This is what it means to be sex positive in some way. And I think that that's actually been perhaps the norm longer for men, and we're kind of used to that. And that is, I think the phrase toxic masculinity is made fun of a lot in conservative circles. But I actually do think that that's kind of a toxic attitude that we've just accepted for men, that they should be just out there doing it, chasing tail every day, all day. But for women, I think it feels a little bit new and noticeable. And I talk about it in the book in the context of sex positivity, and I sort of call it uncritical sex positivity. The term sex positivity was, developed by the feminist movement in the late 80s, and it was used in a very specific context. The journalist Ellen Willis used it to suggest that, actually women should be respected. Their sexuality was not something to be ignored, that it should be okay and even good for women to talk about what they want, that women did not need to swear off relationships with men to be good feminists. That was the actual meaning of the term as used in the first essay where it was written. But today the term has kind of ballooned, it feels like. Sex positivity means just being up for it all the time, being open to experimentation of all kinds, never yucking anyone's yum, being good, giving, and game, and trying it, because trying it is what adventurous women do. And that feels like a pressure of almost a different kind. If, before people were rebelling against a pressure never to speak of sex and not to have it at all, now it feels like there's a pressure in the opposite direction, that you should be having it, you should be having as much as possible, and you should be enjoying it, and if you're not, there's something wrong with you. And that doesn't feel like freedom to me. I mean, if the other end wasn't freedom, this isn't freedom either.
So you just reminded me of, the don't yuck my yum was, I think I had heard it before I read it in your book, and tried to block it out. But also...
It's not the best phrase.
But a more common phrase, which isn't as gross on the surface, but is kink shaming. It appears in your book in one of the more harrowing and I think poignant scenes where you're talking about Armie Hammer, who's I guess he's an actor who was, like many of these guys, kind of a sexual predator, it seemed. But was he a predator? Because some of this stuff was consensual, but it was also gross. And I'm a baseball fan, so there's a pitcher, Trevor Bauer. Well, do you know who Trevor Bauer is?
No.
Okay, so he was a LA Dodgers pitcher. He was also a Cleveland Indians pitcher, but casting bad guys as Dodgers or Yankees makes for a neater story. So Trevor Bauer, LA Dodgers pitcher, was accused of sexual assault, and then his defense was, here are the texts from this woman showing me that she wanted me to be violent in these various ways. And when you tell this Armie Hammer story, it's even worse. It has to do with cannibalism, right? And there was some pushback on the idea of shaming his cannibalism. I mean, talk a little bit about that, because this is, I think this gets at the heart of the problem of consent as the only standard.
Yeah, that was a harrowing story just to watch, and I'm going to try and think through how to talk about this. Tim warned me to be clean in this conversation, which I appreciate, and this is just a weird story. Yes. So, so Armie Hammer's fetish involved basically harming and degrading and sort of maybe playing at, but maybe being serious about cannibalism with these girlfriends he had, who then later complained that he had abused them. And his defense, or the defense of his press team, was, no, these women agreed to it. This is his preference, and they knew what they were getting into, and this was an intimate relationship between the two. And first of all, is it really that normal that, the way that you receive, sexual pleasure is by degrading and abusing your partner? Should we just consider that to be a good thing as a general rule? Second of all, the fact that in the mass media, when this was covered by sites like Bustle or Refinery 29, the coverage was, honestly, I found it almost humorously confounding. I think it was Slate brought in a sort of licensed cannibal practitioner or something, like a BDSM dungeon master who was like, it's not that the cannibalism is the problem, it's the fact that he didn't get her consent to practice cannibalism.
But then you come in all judgy in this book.
Yeah, and I was like, actually, I kind of think that cannibalism is bad. I think we should just not be doing that. And I found it fascinating that the only way to talk about how this was a bad thing was to say, well, he didn't get the right kind of consent, not to actually make sort of, I think, a very obvious moral case for, there are ways that we should treat each other, to respect each other's human dignity, and branding your partner is not one of them. I found it fascinating that we couldn't say that. And I mean, that was an extreme case that I used in the book. But in that same chapter, I talk about a young woman I met at a party, and first off, if you're writing a book about sex, people just tell you stuff.
I was kind of shocked. I was like, wow, these parties
I was also
she goes
kind of shocked.
Strangers come up to her and tell her, yes.
Yeah, okay, trying to think of how to talk through this one too. This woman was telling me about this guy that she was dating. She really liked him, but he choked her during sex, and she didn't really like that, but she consented to it, and maybe this was normal. Is it okay? And she was asking me if it was okay. First, sort of in kind of multiple senses. Is it okay that this is happening? Is it okay for me to not like this? You know, as if she was too afraid even to say, like, I think this is bad. She felt bad judging this person who was surprise strangling her. And the fact that it seemed so hard to, again, just make a moral judgment. Like, even if you consent to this, even if this has been ostensibly consented to, you can still say that something is wrong. Something is off about this encounter, about how you're being treated. I found that really shocking and sad, and it seemed to encapsulate so much about what seemed off in our sexual culture. The inability to make moral claims, ethical claims, apart from sort of the very baseline, almost fig leaf of consent.
Yeah, I'm gonna slightly try to, I don't want to say sanitize the discussion, but move to something a little more positive that I love throughout the book that I hadn't thought of before. But you kept using the word connectedness, but you also interestingly kept contrasting it at times. So you're talking about the contemporary idea of freedom in this arena. By, quote, by freedom, we mean more privacy, more space, less connection, and less constraint. And then you say, in fact, what we need for better sex might be more connectedness, more independence. So you weren't just saying that we need more restraint, which is sort of an interesting kind of conservative idea, but more connectedness. And the idea of autonomy and liberation going together. And on the other hand, connectedness and restraint going together, I don't think is necessarily that intuitive, but as you laid it out here in the book, I thought it seemed clear. So talk more about why you focused on connection as being in contrast to autonomy almost. Or am I mischaracterizing?
No, that's perfectly correct. And it's kind of a broad topic, so I'm trying to think of a way to sort of hone in on the question. I think one of the threads running through our sexual culture today, and that many of the people I spoke to in the book kind of expressed, even if they didn't sort of know the words, was this idea that they felt that they had been told that freedom was the goal, that the goal of the sexual revolution was to loosen us from our boundaries, loosen us from our constraints, allow us to be, free actors, able to go out and have as much sex as we want and not be responsible to anyone else, to be able to stand on our own 2 feet and not depend on anyone else, to not have, ties and like emotional commitments weighing us down. And then at the end of the day, many of these people find that sort of freedom looks a lot like loneliness, actually. That what they in fact wanted was to be interdependent, to commit to someone, to care and be cared for. But that didn't seem like the norm, and it almost seemed countercultural to express that. And I think in the book I argue a lot for that, against the idea that what we need is to be less reliant on each other, that we need to sever ourselves even further, that actually we need to be trying to see each other as real people, to really connect, and that the best sexual encounter, or the best relationship is not, in fact, one where sort of 2 free individuals collide at night and then disappear the next day, never, to be heard from again, but one in which, sex is seen as an experience of mutuality, of responsibility, of relationship.
Yep, and that idea of connection versus liberation, I think is incredibly important, because in this town you will encounter a disproportionate number of people who were like, I hated my stifling small town back in Iowa, and I had to come here where I could be my own person and nobody would know who I was. And that there's a lot of people like that's a perfectly fine mindset, and there's a lot of people like that. I think they're totally overrepresented in the commentariat in Washington, D.C., and they see a threat on one side, which is sort of a Scarlet Letter town, or the Iowa town from not Dirty Dancing, but Footloose, from Footloose, thank you. And that's what they're rebelling against. And sure, maybe the Iowa town from Footloose, I mean, it'd actually be a good article. You should write this one, Micah, how the Iowa town in Footloose was actually good. But maybe it was good, maybe it was an extreme, but that's the only danger they can see. And the idea of an alienated, isolated individual, on the other hand, I mean, I think about the good things in my life. It's my wife and my kids and my parish, the things I'm stuck to, the things I belong to that have a claim on me, and that I can't just instantly unplug from. And yeah, that's like a really conservative argument, but I also think it's becomes pretty obvious to people as you progress through your 20s, right? And that's what you were finding, was that people who weren't sort of ideologically connected in the way that I might be to, who hadn't been reading Richard Weaver and Wendell Berry in their teens, but they were finding, you know what, actually, autonomy taken to an extreme leaves me without a connection. You were finding that in the late chapters you talk about sitting down with these college students at a I was going to say a diner, but that's not New York City enough, at some posh breakfast joint, and they're like, maybe before I have sex, I want to actually love a person. And that was an epiphany to them.
Yeah, it felt really radical to them, actually, which I was amused and delighted to see. And also, I'm sorry, Micah, a writer can go nowhere without being assigned a new piece. It's constant. You'll never escape it. Yeah, I mean, I think there are two things there also to that definition of freedom. One is that in the book, and I think this may be a little bit not AEI's normal lane, but I do tie this sort of push towards freedom to kind of the ravages of late capitalism, honestly. You know, one of the things that people have been told is that they have to be able to optimize themselves on the market. They need to be able to chase after that good job and that salary first and sort of figure everything else out later, you know, at some other time. They need to be free to be sort of the best market optimizing individuals they can be. And, you know, having a spouse or having kids, you know, will tie you down. And that's kind of presented sort of in an underlying way in this culture too. So it's not just sort of like an abstract idea of freedom, but often it's freedom explicitly directed towards, well, you want to be able to achieve, don't you? You want to be able to make money or do something career-wise, don't you? That's why you shouldn't settle down.
Well, since you brought up capitalism, I'll try to make a defense of capitalism here. I think you say that capitalism either co-opted or corrupted the sexual revolution. And what I would say is the sexual revolution was corrupt from the beginning, and it was a misapplication of capitalism into a realm in which it didn't apply. So I'll let you answer either of these two questions. Can you defend the sort of the sexual revolution from the beginning as something that might have been good and was co-opted, or you can just attack capitalism if you want?
Well, actually, can you say more about what you mean by?
So capitalism is not any moral argument. It's a utilitarian argument that free exchange in the terms of goods and services, some services, free exchange in the terms of goods and services optimizes societal wealth, as well as reflecting a decent respect for human liberty. But most importantly, you're going to have a wealthier society if people can basically buy stuff and sell stuff as they want. And so in that way, people being wealthier, more prosperous is a good thing. So it's a tool, it's an instrument. It's not a good in itself. And it shouldn't be considered a moral system. So I have many libertarian friends who sort of see it almost as a moral system. And the way you were just talking about optimizing your value, et cetera, if you apply that to other aspects of life, like, you know, your marriage, your children, your family, or your sex, you're misapplying it. It's an instrument that in the realm of commerce provides the good of increasing prosperity, because decentralized knowledge is going to do a lot better than some central planner. But it's not a moral thing in itself. And you see, I think, that the capitalist mindset applied to sexuality is corrupting. And I would agree with that. I don't think that's an argument either for the sexual revolution or against capitalism.
Sure. No, I see what you mean there. I mean, I think that you can say that capitalism is a good way to produce wealth, but it's hard not to see how quickly the capitalist mindset, as you put it, does begin to sort of creep into our interactions with other people if we continue to define sort of the best way for the world to work and the spaces of the world that we spend the most time in as, through this capitalist landscape. This is how you get to sort of the woman I, interviewed in the book saying that, she ordered a guy off of Tinder like a product. When you, think about everything in terms of exchange and, doing the best exchange to profit the most, it's hard not to slide from, thinking of your interactions as exchanges, from thinking of other people as commodities. And I mean, consent, this sort of informed consent, this trading ideal, we both go into something in agreement so that we can get the best out of it. That is sort of the ethos of capitalism, and that is also the ethos of consent. And consent has been absorbed into how we think about sex, and turns it into a transaction. And the people consenting to the transaction view each other as, commodities. And they view their sexual encounters as trying to get something from the other person, rather than seeing the other person as fully human. So I do think that it's a corrupting influence, whether it's meant to be or not.
Yeah. So transactional versus relational, I think, is a huge problem, a huge way of describing the problems with our society. And you do a good job of explaining how seeing other people as transaction, seeing interactions with other people as a simple transaction can be corrupting. How not seeing the other person as a person in themselves, and that certainly can reflect a kind of capitalist mindset, I think expanded beyond its realms. But I also just, the idea that if somebody else agrees to it, you can't be held responsible for what happens is certainly something I see all the time. And you get it, I get it on Twitter, both from left and from right, of people saying, well, I can't, if you didn't want this, you should have not agreed to it. The idea of exploitation as a bad thing to do has no place, no role in this world where, well, if you consented to it, it's okay. And I still remember there was this article about this guy who was running this scam on Airbnb, and he describes how he would list a house, and then he would say, oh, well, the house isn't available. Will you agree to this lesser house? And the article said, well, you can't blame the guy for running this because Airbnb didn't ban it. And at every step of the way, the person was agreeing to what I was like, no, I can blame him. I do blame him. I blame him right now. I blame him every day. But the idea that you can't blame somebody for taking advantage of somebody or harming another person because that person agreed to be harmed is somehow so deeply embedded in our mindset that it trickles outside the realm of commerce and into these personal relationships. And that's one of the sort of depressing things that hit me. In a few, we're going to have to throw it open to the audience questions. One of the things you say in this book is that men and women are different. That used to not be controversial. Say something now that will get you in trouble about how men and women are different.
Wow. Canceled so soon? So early in our conversation?
Why is it important to say that men and women are different in this book about rethinking sex?
Yeah. I wrote this chapter, Men and Women Are Not the Same, and I actually felt a little bit of a shudder. I was like, am I going to get canceled for this? Should I chest feeding people? Or, I don't know, some other euphemism? But, I think one of the arguments that I make in Rethinking Sex is that we have to be honest about the world that we live in and the realities of sort of the moral universe and the bodies that we inhabit. And so much of our culture right now seems to be kind of based on the primacy of the will almost, I I say this is so, so of course it must be so, it should be so. And one of the things that I think is kind of haunting our sexual culture is this also, frankly, false interpretation of the feminist movement that says, well, men and women are just the same, and they're equal, and by equal we mean the same. Women should just be like men. Women should, in fact, inhabit sometimes the worst habits of the worst kind of man.
I saw, even before you said that, I was like, you're
succeed.
describing people saying all the worst things men should do. Women should do that, and that'll be equality.
Right. Yeah. I mean, well, we have Playboy. For equality, we should have Playgirl. It's like, I'm not sure that women want that. And also, I don't think that that's necessarily a good thing. But, I talk about in Rethinking Sex that we have to be honest so that we can actually respect people as the humans they are. And again, respect people's human dignity. And to respect women, I think you have to see women as women with their sort of individuality and vulnerabilities intact. And, frankly, women are different than men. When it comes to sex in particular, women have vulnerabilities and possibilities that men don't. They can get pregnant. They are smaller than men generally, which makes situations more unsafe for women. And when it comes to sort of a sexual culture and a sexual timeline, many women feel a biological, pressure to have kids at a certain point. And to sort of not acknowledge these facts, to not allow women to express, their needs in our sexual culture means that women end up sort of agreeing to things, agreeing to relationships, agreeing to, again, cultural standards that in the long run don't serve them, that don't serve their human flourishing, that don't bring them happiness or bring them closer to the relationships that they want. And by being honest about how men and women are different and how men should therefore treat women and what women should expect from men and ask from men in relationships, our sexual culture would be much improved.
So I've long thought that the sort of Western, you could call it a Christian, it's probably bigger than that, idea of monogamous marriage oriented towards family was kind of a pro-woman idea. I mean, I know it's the patriarchy, it's evil and all of that stuff, but just there's an argument that what sort of dudes would want is promiscuity, etc. If you just looked at it evolutionarily, right? Like sleeping around and not taking care of your kids, you'll have a bunch of kids, maybe nobody will be looking out for them, but you're going to have more heirs in the long run. But from a female perspective, no, having the guy around to help you take care of your kids makes it more likely for them to survive. And then you throw in the concerns about sexual violence, the idea, which is, again, men versus women, that like you're more likely going to want an emotional connection, a loving connection to a sexual encounter. It seems to me that the sexual revolution and decoupling sex from family, from love, from marriage, from family formation was a trick played by sex-hungry guys to try to just get rid of all the rules and make it easier.
I'm not going to lie, it does feel like that. And I write in Rethinking Sex a little bit about kind of the earlier history of the sexual revolution and the evolution of Playboy magazine in particular. And Hugh Hefner declared that he was a feminist, actually, that his naked women were breaking down a Puritan culture. But it was very clear that this was just for Hugh Hefner to have more people to have sex with. He wasn't doing this because he really wanted to be kind to women. And I think there was a real sort of taking advantage of a moment in which women did want to see their freedom recognized, their equality recognized, and sort of that was bent towards the norm of, unfortunately, like men having more power and using women in many cases. And not all men, obviously, and not all women, but this does seem to be the case when you look at the sexual culture today. And it is interesting in talking to men and women and looking at the research. I will say that one of the things that I found funniest was an academic paper by the researcher Debbie Herbenick, in which she was talking to college students about their sort of sexual regrets, and what constituted sort of a bad opportunity. And women talked about encounters in which, there wasn't enough sort of commitment and they weren't able to experience much pleasure because like the other person didn't know them, they didn't know them, whatever. And men were more likely to talk about opportunities that they'd had to have sex that they didn't take up, which did seem to be kind of a point in your favor there.
I think I wasn't talking about that in my high school graduation speech when I said you'll regret the mistakes the things you didn't do more than the mistakes you made. But I think that does reflect the male mindset. Okay, before we throw it to the audience, I'm going to give you at least one push from the left from a negative review and one more push from the right. This is from actually a Christian magazine, Sojourners, criticizing the book. Says, Emba is, quote, reiterating gender roles and differences, decrying kink culture and casual sex, and attaching the values of purity to our sexual encounters. And they mean this as a negative. And adds, for those of us raised in environments where anything other than heterosexual vanilla sex for cisgender people within the confines of marriage would send you to hell, Rethinking Sex might feel dismissive as it overtly dances around touchy subjects, etc. Emba wants us to respect those differences when we think about sex and dating, but that's the sort of argument I've seen used to defend complementarianism, the theological view that men and women should be forced into roles based on their biological sex for years. So, I just have a sort of curious question, like, are you getting significant pushback in this vein? But B, are you worried that this book, if it catches on, is going to send us back to a patriarchal day where all we have is vanilla cisgendered heterosexual sex?
Wow, what an accusation. I'm very offended. No, is this the critique from the left?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's the bad faith reading of this book, right? That actually I'm just advocating for deep conservative norms and want to send women, back to the kitchen barefoot, whatever. That's actually not the case, obviously. I do think that the sexual revolution and the feminist movements were valuable, that it was important to state very clearly that women are equal to men and their desires and lives, do matter and should be, heard and listened to as much as men's. And I think we've made, important steps forward in sort of moving away from punishing people for not conforming to a very explicit and narrow understanding of what sex should be that might not even be correct. That said, I think that we have norms for a reason. And ethical frameworks for a reason. And I don't think necessarily that conservative views of sex or even traditional views of sex are necessarily sort of bad or oppressive. We look at religion and we look at, tradition as sort of ways of figuring out how people have grappled with big questions and big issues over time. How to live as a human in the world with others over centuries. And perhaps the fact that we keep coming back to these very clear and seemingly obvious realizations about sex being meaningful, sex, something to be careful of, to have in a proper context. Maybe that means that there's some wisdom there that we shouldn't just throw out the door just because it feels old.
So then speaking of norms, there's a norm that sex is properly oriented towards family formation and in a monogamous lifelong union. The word monogamy, I don't think appears in this book. I should have gotten the ebook and double checked that. When you talk about the idea of waiting till marriage for sex. You say the train has left the station. Not all of us got on that train. But also the idea of sex as the thing that makes babies, I think gets mentioned about 4 times for about a sentence each in the book. So why don't you give more weight to sex as a inherently procreative act and to the traditional Catholic and Christian understanding that marriage is the proper setting for sex?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that is a pushback that I've gotten that I think is maybe somewhat more valid. I think there are 2 answers to that. One is that I actually think that most people get this. I think maybe many people in this room are sort of familiar with the concept of sort of luxury beliefs and luxury values. But actually, I do think that marriage is still held to be a good thing that people strive for, that they want. Like many of the people in this book, and I do mention monogamy actually pretty frequently, say that they want a committed relationship, that that's what they want for their sex lives. They just don't know how to get it in this culture, or they don't know that they should move to it earlier rather than later. So that's one reason. The other, I think, is an audience, reason. Frankly, I think that conservatives and people with religious backgrounds and upbringing have a lot of resources, actually, when it comes to talking about sex, understanding the place for sex, a vision of what it might look like in that context. And, I wasn't necessarily writing this book for sort of my Catholic friends who have that model before them very obviously and very clearly. I was writing this book for those people who are kind of muddling around and can't quite figure out why the thing that they want feels sort of out of their grasp. And, frankly, there have been other books about sex that, really go really hard at the idea of well, you should stop doing this thing that you're doing and get married. That's the only way, you're going to be happy ever. And that is not a winsome approach, I find, actually. Most people are not going to necessarily read that book or feel sort of compelled to follow that path if it's sort of forced upon them. I think what I was trying to do in this book was try and have a kind of first principles conversation with the reader, asking people, okay, this is what you want from your relationships. This is a thing that you're doing. Where do you see these 2 things connecting? This is how you say that you feel about sex. This is what you think that sex is when I ask you about it. You want intimacy. You think it's meaningful. Say more about that. What does that then imply for your sex life moving forward? It's subtitled A Provocation, not a prescription. And I want to help people sort of walk along that
catechism,
path. Yeah. But I also wanted to meet readers where they were.
Well, I think it does a very good job of doing that, and I'm glad for your book. And I think, if this gets handed out to every freshman at orientation rather than the movie that you described that they're forced to watch, it would be a lot better. We'll open it up for questions from the audience. There's Luis in the back has a microphone. We've got a pair of microphones, so raise your hand, we'll bring it to you. Try to make the question as brief as possible and as closely resembling a question as possible. We'll start right here in the blue polo.
Christine, in relation...
Just grab the mic to make it
Thank
easy.
you. Christine, in relation to the family side of this argument, I'm sure you noticed that Yoram Hazony recently came out with an endorsement of the mafia-style family against the nuclear family, not dissimilar from David Brooks's argument on the same topic about 2 years ago. I think the exact titles were "The Nuclear Family Has Failed," and the new one is "The Nuclear Family Was a Mistake," or something like that. I was wondering what you think of that notion of this broader kind of old world sense of familialism as opposed to the 20th century nuclear familialism, and how that relates to your general understanding of sex and the sexual revolution and all those kind of frame. And also specifically, what do you think of that horseshoe being linked between the nationalists and the centrists on another front too?
That's a really good question. I think that both of those pieces were given really splashy headlines that don't really reflect what is in the actual arguments. So in both pieces that you mentioned, what's really being argued is not that, children shouldn't have a mother and a father, or that families should be exploded, but rather that families should be expanded, that there should be more connection between children, their parents, and their aunts and uncles, their grandparents, their neighbors. That in general, our web should be wider and our nets deeper, and that actual sort of the very nuclear family shouldn't be as isolated as it is. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I mean, we talked about this question of sort of dependence, interdependence, and connection already in this book, but the question of loneliness and who you can look to and be looked out for by is a really important one. In the book, actually, one area in which I talk about this a little bit, this is maybe slightly off of your question, is a critique of dating apps and online dating and the ideal of privacy in our sexual culture as sort of a primary win. And when I talk about privacy, I guess I mean the idea that we conduct all of our relationships sort of one-on-one with no outside involvement. If before you might meet a partner through friends or family or your church, now you just sort of meet them on an app and you do whatever you want and nobody ever hears what happened. And that, again, is something that kind of feels like freedom. And that has become so much more common with the rise of swipeable apps especially. But you lose this sense of responsibility often to the other person because you have no ties. There's no community that's helping you uphold standards, whether it's relational standards in how you should treat the other person or how they should treat you, or even just the responsibility to, not ghost on someone, which, if you had met them through your extended mafia family, maybe you wouldn't because, something might happen. But again, if you're kind of inscribed in this tiny sort of nuclear family or just individual net, then there's no one to ask for recourse when things go wrong.
Well, and you describe well kind of community, extended family networks as having a regulating effect. And one of the things that when I look at like the Title IX stuff, or you describing sort of the colleges with their ever increasing, like, let's just make consent even more watertight. It's an attempt to legislate in replacement of sort of community. So in the end, you say something about like, well, we don't want to rely on shame or stigma, but to some extent, at least in this regard, you're saying like, no, you should be embarrassed if you just totally mistreated that girl. And there should be some shame and stigma.
Oh, to be clear, I'm actually not totally against shame and stigma. I mean, one of the arguments in this book, right, is that actually we should make moral judgments. I would say that we don't necessarily need to rely on prison for every bad date. And I think that was a fear that people had sort of during the Me Too moment. Like, if this goes wrong, like, am I going to be branded as a sex offender forever? That rarely goes well. And usually the people most harmed are those, who have the least resources. But social regulation is important. There are norms. There should be understandings of how we behave to each other that are upheld by our friends and family and community. That would be a good thing. We teach each other how to behave. And yeah, I think we should bring that back.
All right, more questions. Yes, up here in the middle.
I have kind of two questions in one. Do you think that the level of anxiety and depression that we are seeing in society right now, especially the young people, is precisely because they really don't know how to respect sex? Because sex has the life of its own, and sexuality is something that is not a penis or a vagina and an exchange of fluids, really. It really falls into the spiritual, that entity that we cannot see. So the girls come into college already having experience of 4, 5, 6, 7 people. They go into college and they think that that's the norm. And men, being not secure on themselves, they approach the women and they exert that violence on them. And the woman, thanks to 15 Shades of Grey, think that, okay, this is the solution to better sex, and buy into this stupidity, and then depression comes and anxiety comes, and then you have campus, like a carpet of girls that are totally imbalanced precisely because they don't know how to, they don't know how sex can enslave them. That's really the word I would use, because it does, what I have seen in young people.
Thank you. I think that's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, there is actually a chapter in the book literally called "Sex is Spiritual," and it is really about this other misconception that I think we have been given in our current sexual moment, that sex is an activity like any other. It's like skiing, but slightly more dangerous, and also use a condom. When in fact, it is a unique activity. It's something different that touches not just our bodies, but in some senses our souls. And I talk to a lot of women and men in this book who sort of realize this, but sort of don't know how to express it. And many who have had these sexual encounters and find themselves really deeply hurt, but don't really know how to connect it in some ways. Or when they do, it's only sort of later on, and that shapes their behavior later, often in positive ways. I mean, I think that in terms of anxiety and sort of depression among young people today, yeah, I think a lot of it is due to sort of a lack of connection and a sort of uncertainty of how to go about connecting with people. And that is because in some ways sex has been presented in ways that is both false and confusing. And I think that, sexual encounters, especially bad sexual encounters that, again, we're told to shrug off because it's just sex, it doesn't matter, or you consented to it, so what are you complaining about now? Can leave people with wounds that if, they can't address them, they can't heal from.
And so it's interesting to see these during the Me Too stuff, some of the Army Hammer stuff, etc., to watch guys who would sort of worry, now, even if something is consensual, I can get busted for it. And worrying that this was this police state. And me thinking, okay, on the one hand, I don't like the Title IX police state type stuff on a college campus where a girl has a regrettable thing and says it's sexual assault. But on the other hand, I'm thinking, well, there's an easy way to avoid that. And one of the things you argue for later in the book is maybe have less sex. Which is not a very fun conclusion, but...
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's kind of that's the thing. There are a couple of levels to this, actually. I talked to a number of psychologists for this book, too, and one thing that one of them said to me was that, men in their 20s are scared, and they talk about it a lot. They're scared that if they ask someone out, they might have actually been just really nice people before, and, they didn't want to cross boundaries. But now they feel that if they make any wrong move, something is going to happen, they'll be canceled or Me Too'd, and they'll, never progress. And so they just don't, and then find themselves alone. One guy I talked to talked about asking out a woman at work, and he used the metaphor of handing someone a loaded shotgun and was like, I mean, it could be fine, but I was like, okay, what? That seems extreme, but that is how you end up kind of alone and anxious and lonely. At the same time, though, exactly what you were saying, there are these guys who are like, well, I don't want to be Me Too'd for, expressing my kink. And it's like, look, if the thing that you want to do with your partner is something that is so close to the line of sexual assault that you're worried you might be accused of sexual assault, you probably should not be doing that. If you think that you'll be accused of rape for doing something, it seems like it's probably past the line. And I think it's okay to say that at this point.
We get a virtual question from Catherine Borowski. In the 1990s, and when I was in college, sort of a push of an increase in women identifying as bisexual, or college women identifying as lesbians, and normalization of swingers. If you read like the sex advice column in Slate.com, there's one guy who's like, oh, this is kind of weird. My wife and I agreed to have sex with other people, and it was gross. And it was like, well, you're the one who's wrong for judging and not paying attention to your partner and worrying about your wife, with this other dude, et cetera. So the normalization of swinging, and just in general, the boundary pushing, increasing adoption of transgenderism, et cetera. Sort of that doesn't get a lot of explicit attention in the book, but what's your comment on that? It's not an easy one, but it's definitely related.
Wow. Well, I guess
It's all generally about saying we're overcoming the old conservative traditional bonds of monogamy, of even just like having a single sexuality or a single gender, or et cetera.
Yeah, I was going to say let's start with swinging, but actually let's not. Yeah, I mean, again, as I talk about in Rethinking Sex, there was this idea, right, that we needed to break down all of the boundaries, that any sort of restraint was repression. And really, once we got free enough, then everything would be perfect and everything would be good. And instead, what we're finding is that there's never free enough, it sort of feels like. And the more free that things get, actually, it seems for a lot of people that it's becoming more confusing, right, as this sort of open field of anything that you want to do and you should do it is rolled out before people, they begin to feel a bit lost and not even clear what will actually bring them happiness. And then, as we talked about at the very beginning, a sort of pressure to be experimental, even if you don't really want to be. On TikTok, like young people are being shamed for being vanilla and not sort of liking knife play enough or something. Yeah, I find that to be extreme, but I also think that people are beginning to wake up to this a little bit. I wrote a column for the Washington Post a couple weeks ago about radical monogamy, which there was this Vice trend piece, like of course it was by Vice, and it was about these people who had sort of experimented with like all sorts of alternative relationships and polyamory and sort of group sex and whatever. And then they realized that actually what they really wanted was to be in a relationship with one person who was committed to them. And practitioners of this strange new trend called it radical monogamy because it was monogamy that had been, fully reconsidered, and they'd like seen the other options, and they weren't doing it just because it's what their parents did or what the church told them to do. It was because they really wanted it, and they realized that it would take work. And
It's
it was
its
kind of
own
like,
form of bondage, right? You're bonding yourself to one person for lifetime.
Bonding yourself to one
Radical.
person, and so it was radical, and it was, it's funny, and I laughed, but I was also like, good luck to you, like best wishes. I'm glad you've figured this out for yourself. After testing out all kinds of freedom, you arrive at sort of the place that you were always going to arrive at all along. Good for you. But it would be nice, I think it would be better if people didn't feel like they had to feel the pressure to, move away from what they really wanted first before coming back to it.
No, that being handed a script in life is not always being shackled. It's being guided by tradition. And yeah, here I go being super conservative, so I'll open it up to the questions. Everybody over there has a question. We'll go to Ben.
First, I'm Ben Story. I'm a visiting fellow here at SCCS and AEI. And Christine, just want to start by thanking you for writing a book that attempts to persuade people who aren't already on the right path on this. That's a useful kind of book. I've spent a lot of time with young people. I've been a college professor for 17 years. And a lot of young women, in particular, lovely young people they're deeply depressed because they're wandering through this kind of chaotic landscape. What do you see as, do you discuss reasons for hope in the book? What looks hopeful in this landscape to you?
Very good question. One of the conversations that I found most hopeful was the one that Tim sort of gestured at earlier in our conversation, where I was having brunch with these college students, and they were kind of coming to this conclusion, the conclusions that I suggest in this book, but like pretty early, actually, for themselves in college, having surveyed the hookup landscape and, the sort of cultural landscape of sex that they'd been handed, and in some instances, tried it out for themselves. They realized pretty quickly, like, actually, I don't really want this, and were beginning to feel enough freedom themselves to be like, I'm gonna not. Like, maybe, I do actually want to love someone before I have sex with them, and I guess I'm just gonna wait and do that. One of the college students I was talking to in this conversation was telling me, I was like talking with this friend group, like a couple of girls and a guy, and she was telling me about how they'd talked about this friend who had hooked up with someone and how the person seemed really nice and how he actually didn't want to have sex immediately. He wanted to like get to know her, and they were also impressed by this. And then another friend jumped in and was like, yeah, but we shouldn't have to treat this guy like he's a unicorn. Like, there should be more people like this, and we should just find more people like this and be people like this. They were like, yeah, that's true.
And then the exact quote is, so maybe people should stop hooking up until they love each other.
Yeah, but I mean, I think the fact that, young people seem to be coming to this realization earlier, and also I think feeling at least, one good thing about there being sort of a multiplicity of options is that maybe this becomes an option again for people to choose. There is kind of a pushback among young people against sort of sex positivity and sort of this girl bossy, just be like the guys feminism that I'm seeing in younger generations, and that also kind of gives me hope.
I like the discussion of girl boss, because it's like, when did we think bosses and CEOs were good, right? I thought we were supposed to.
It's capitalism.
All right, more questions. Yes.
Yeah, so Christine, thank you for taking the time to speak to us, first of all. You're in conversation with a guy who wrote a book about alienation that I really enjoyed, and that's primarily talking about religion. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like alienation among young people when it comes to the sexual landscape, and then also to what extent does, or what role does religion have to play in this? Like, are young people going to rediscover a healthy sexual lifestyle because they return to religion? And if yes, why? And if not, also why? Like, I'm curious to see, like, do you see this happening like en masse, or is it just like sort of individualized small conversations like the examples we've been talking about?
Yeah, I guess there's a negative and a positive, or two ways of looking at just that question. I mean, I think that alienation is a major factor, or sort of a major underlying problem that runs through this book, right? There are people who feel alienated from themselves and from their own desires. They know that they want commitment, or they know that they want a relationship or something meaningful, and yet they don't feel like they can achieve it. Or they consent to things that they don't really want, and then, kind of as a result of this sort of consent breakdown, have this sort of what the Georgetown professor Robin West describes as hedonic dysphoria, where, you've consented to something, so it should be good, right? But you're not experiencing it as good, so you think that it's something wrong with you, and then you become alienated from, your own desire, being able to trust yourself to know what's good for you or what you should want. And then, of course, there's alienation from other people. I talk to young men who, substitute pornography for their relationships and then realize that, like, they can't actually relate to human women because they're so used to relating to an avatar on a screen, and they're alienated in that way. And sort of this distance between human beings and human persons and, souls from bodies, and people from kind of a larger community of care is a big and sad underlying theme here. As for a return to religion sort of helping to cure this alienation, I'm not sure. I mean, they're also really, I think that would be you'd have to ask that in a really specific context, right? It's possible that people will return to faith and find, a positive view of sex and a positive view of relationships that they then feel like they can go after and sort of lessen their alienation that way. There's also, unfortunately, a sort of purity culture, religious understanding of sex that I think I criticize a little in the book, and people who say this book is just trying to bring us back to purity culture are rightly afraid of, which alienated people from sort of sex and each other and their bodies in another way. I think the solutions are really individual. I think just being honest about where that alienation is occurring, and that it is, in fact, a problem, that the isolation is, in fact, a negative thing, but is also fixable in some ways if you try, is the first step.
Let's talk about the worries about purity culture. Because first of all, when I read the negative review of your book, I felt like, as a conservative, I always feel like we're sliding down the slippery slope at 100 miles an hour. And every once in a while, we get a Washington Post op-ed saying if we stop our acceleration, we'll be catapulted right back up to the top. And the idea, New York State public schools in the 1990s was when I went to high school, and basically the only ethic they taught us, if there was anything, was consent. It was total, a caricature of John Stuart Mill, and like we were literally encouraged to, you should have sex, you should experiment, just know the consequences of your actions, etc. And then I came into the Catholic Church, which one of the first things I read was, the parts of the theology of the body. There's a rich history of, you wouldn't call it sex positivity, but it's kind of sex positivity.
We call it sex
positivity. We're for that. So I didn't experience, and sometimes I'm tempted to chalk up as a liberal caricature the idea of anti-sex Christianity, but you state repeatedly in the book that you did have encounters with a negative purity culture and sex negative religiosity. So say more about that. Go deeper, because again, I ran into the opposite my whole life.
Yeah, so I grew up in Virginia, outside of Richmond, and we had like an abstinence-only sex ed curriculum, which basically, taught about the mechanics of sex, but nothing about sort of relationships, which is, just unhelpful. It's sort of like learning kind of what internal combustion means, but like those red things have 8 sides, like don't worry about it. Like we don't need to know about that. And, in the evangelical church, in which I grew up, and I'm also a Catholic convert, actually, there was a lot of discussion about sort of, again, this purity culture view of sex, where like you shouldn't talk about sex or have it or feel sexual urges, until you're married. But then once you're married and you have to get married, sex is going to be awesome and it'll be great because, God is going to, fulfill the promises that he, promised you because you waited long enough. And that's also a really skewed vision of sex, right? Like, how to make that leap, I think, for a lot of people can be really painful. And then also, a sort of almost sexual prosperity gospel, where by sort of like behaving yourself early, you'll get a prize. And then if you don't get the prize for whatever reason, if you don't immediately get married, or like you get married and your sex life isn't perfect, you feel like there's something wrong with you. And I think that can be really harmful too. And both of those approaches also sort of make sex out as sort of the most important thing in the world, even as, they're saying you should not have it instead of, you should be having it all the time. That centers it in a way that I think is kind of distorting for a lot of people and can still be very unhealthy.
So there's an image that you referred to, which I don't know if you explicitly were given this in school, but of an already chewed piece of gum is to describe a woman who isn't a virgin at her wedding. And but I was thinking, isn't there a way? Because again, in Catholic teaching, sex should be saved for marriage. Isn't there a way to hold out an ideal that sex is for marriage and it's for in a marriage oriented towards family formation and it's a lifelong monogamous relationship, to hold up that ideal without having this idea that if you fall short of this ideal, you're now due to be spit out on the ground? And so if I were rethinking sex, that's what I would look for, to hold out, to not change our ideals, but to make sure we, in the real world, have a way to talk about, well, we all fall short of this. That's a very Catholic teaching, and how to handle that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important things is that we have to remember both that we are human, and that, sex is mutual. It is about sort of human relationship and seeing each other as fully human, right? With human dignity that does not depend on how much or how little sex we're having, or like who we're doing it with, or whether we're vanilla enough or kinky enough. Putting sex in its proper place, which is a place of responsibility and mutuality, but is also not the whole of the human person or the whole of the human experience.
Yeah, so I think we have time for exactly one more question, if we have it. Yes, over here.
Hi. Thank you both for this conversation. Christine, in your interviews and while writing Rethinking Sex, did you find that a certain way of defining consent was the most clarifying for people? I volunteer at a sexual assault hotline, and we coach visitors on the hotline that an affirmative yes equals consent, and that consent without an affirmative yes or anywhere in those gray areas with drugs or alcohol is not consent, and that consent can be rescinded at any time during sex. And oftentimes that hard line is clarifying for people, but I hear your arguments where the definitions of consent are not serving us, and I agree. So I'd love to know your thoughts on what you think is the best way of defining it.
Yeah, in the book I talk about the idea that consent is a floor, but it was never meant to be the ceiling. And, I do think that there is room for better definitions of consent that try to take into account sort of the variability of feeling and place, whether consent was fairly gotten, whether you should even be doing what you've gotten consent to do. But I just don't think that consent itself is a useful enough tool in some ways. And so, in the book I suggest, I think that consent is a baseline, and I guess people are asking for sort of like, what is the very baseline thing that I have to get? You can explain sort of the most detailed versions of consent. But I think it's also fair to push people past the baseline, to try and clear more than that very low bar. And I suggest actually a standard of willing the good of the other as sort of a higher standard for sex than consent, and one that we could reach towards or hope for, even if we don't always succeed. And willing the good of the other is Aristotle by way of Thomas Aquinas, but the idea is that you should be caring as much about the other person in the encounter's good as you are your own, like true mutuality, and also have some idea of the good in mind, what sex is supposed to mean and what it looks like and what the good would be for that other person and yourself. And if you can't do that, I would suggest that you should abstain from having sex. Or if you don't think that your partner is able to or willing to do that for you, then maybe you shouldn't be having sex with them. I guess we can continue to talk about consent, what you can kind of get away with, or how far someone can push it, basically. But I think we should be just asking for more than that. Not how low we can go, but how high.
Under AEI rules, once a speaker makes an esoteric reference to Aristotle and Catholic teaching in the same
wrote it.
sentence, the conversation is officially over. Christine, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I encourage everyone to read her book, Rethinking Sex. It's excellent, it's brief, and it is a provocation. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks for having me.